Hi, I'm Edith, and I'm here to introduce to you the wonders of H.6.1, which is to define partial pressure. Yay, how exciting! So basically, what partial pressure is pressure exerted by a single type of gas when it is found within a mixture of gases. Like in my lungs right here. If we focus in on a specific area, you can see that there's a high concentration of oxygen. So there is a large mix of gases. So for partial pressure, we focus in on the oxygen gas and the pressure it exerts.
Hey there, my name's Lorena Santos, and I'm going to continue the lesson on with, ta-da, H.6.2. In H.6.2, we have to explain the oxygen dissociation curves of adult hemoglobin, fetal hemoglobin, and myoglobin. But before we start, what exactly is hemoglobin, you ask? Good question. Hemoglobin actually is made up of 4 polypeptide chains, each containing one iron heme group that allows it to reversibly bind to oxygen. So basically, it's a part of the red blood cell that can actually pick up the oxygen. So what's really cool actually about hemoglobin is that it can undergo cooperative binding. Woo! Now, in cooperative binding, this means that once it has picked up one oxygen ion, it's able to change its shape so that it's easier to pick up the rest of them. For example, let me get my buddy over here for a second. Hello, okay, so I'm going to continue off where Lorena left off. Basically what she was saying about hemoglobin was that every time it picks up another oxygen molecule, it's able to change its shape so it's easier for it to pick up new oxygen molecules. So you see, there's one oxygen molecule getting picked up by the hemoglobin, and then once it picks up another molecule, it's able to change its shape, so it's easier to pick up another one. This is going to continue on to each polypeptide. See how it's easier to pick up all 4? It's changing shape so it can pick up more. So now it's really easy for it to pick them all up. And this is known, if you have forgotten already, as cooperative binding. Woo! Woo! And also, it works both ways. So once it loses another oxygen molecule, it's easier to let go of the other ones. Fascinating, isn't it? So now we're going to continue on with the actual oxygen dissociation curve. Ta-da! Here it is. So in this curve, it shows the relationship between the partial pressure of oxygen and the percentage saturation of oxygen carrying the molecules. So at low O2 levels, around here, the percentage saturation will be very low, while at higher levels, the molecules will be very saturated. Because binding potential increases with each additional oxygen molecule, hemoglobin displays a sigmoidal, S-shaped, dissociation curve. So it's going to keep increasing until it reaches a full saturation. Get it? Yeah. So now we'll begin with adult hemoglobin. Now, in adult hemoglobin, the dissociation curve displays a typical sigmoidal shape due to the cooperative binding. So there's low saturation of O2 when partial pressure is low, and high saturation of O2 when partial pressure is high. Now we move on to fetal hemoglobin. Now, for fetal hemoglobin, the fetus has a slightly different molecular composition compared to adult. So the dissociation curve is more towards the left when compared to the adult hemoglobin curve, thus indicating a higher affinity for oxygen. This is important as it means that oxygen will move from the adult hemoglobin to fetal hemoglobin in capillaries of uterus. That means it's easier for me to collect more oxygen because I'm still developing, so I need more. Now it's time for the final oxygen binding molecule, myoglobin. Myoglobin is found in muscles and is made up of one single polypeptide with only one heme group. Because of this, it cannot undergo cooperative binding, because there are no other heme groups to start the reaction. Now, what also makes a myoglobin unique is that it doesn't display a sigmoidal curve. Now, Because it cannot undergo cooperative binding, it also does not create a sigmoidal curve. As you can see in the graph, there is no sign of the S-shaped that is found in both of the other two hemoglobins. So because myoglobin cannot undergo cooperative binding, myoglobin has a greater affinity for oxygen than compared to hemoglobin. So under normal conditions, myoglobin will stay saturated with oxygen and will stay saturated with oxygen until levels drop intensely, such as exercise. I'm tired. Now we will continue the lesson with H.6.3. In H.6.3, we will describe how CO2 is carried by blood, including actions of carbonic anhydrase, the chloride shift, and the buffering of plasma proteins. Carbon dioxide can be transported from tissues to the lungs in 3 ways. To begin with, some are bound to hemoglobin to form carbaminohemoglobin, which is one way it exists in the blood. Binding to CO2 lowers hemoglobin's affinity for O2, however. Number 2, a very small fraction can get dissolved in blood plasma membrane. This is so because CO2 dissolves poorly in water. And finally, a majority diffuse into an erythrocyte and converted into carbonic acid. Because majority of the carbon dioxide is transported from tissues to the lungs, from diffusion into erythrocyte and converted into carbonic acid, we will explain how it is able to travel. When CO2 enters the erythrocyte, it is able to combine with water, catalyzed by carbonic anhydrase, to able to form carbonic acid. The carbonic acid then dissociates into hydrogen ions and a bicarbonate. The bicarbonate is then pumped out of the cell and exchanged with chloride ions to ensure erythrocyte remains unchanged. This is known as chloride shift. Eventually the bicarbonate will be able to combine with sodium ions in blood in order to form sodium bicarbonate. This will then be able to travel to the lungs. Meanwhile, in the erythrocyte, hydrogen ions in the erythrocyte make environment less alkaline, causing hemoglobin to release its oxygen so that it can be used by the cells. The hemoglobin in the erythrocyte then absorbs the hydrogen ions to act as a buffer in order to restore the pH in the cell. Eventually, the hydrogen ions will be released into the lungs in order to reform the CO2, for the CO2 to finally be expelled.
Finally, my turn again, and this time I'll be introducing H.6.4, which is to explain the role of the Bohr shift in the supply of O2 to respiring tissues. So cells with high metabolism release greater amounts of CO2 into our blood. That CO2 then actually happens to lower pH of our blood, which causes hemoglobin to release its oxygen. This is known as the Bohr effect, in which a decrease in the pH, it shifts the OT dissociation curve to the right. This is what it looks like. O2 dissociation shifted to the right.
Exercise of any kind involves the use of skeletal muscle to accomplish movement. The use of skeletal muscle demands the use of ATP molecules, which come from the mitochondria found in muscle cells, and thus the rate of cellular respiration increases dramatically. Active muscle tissue consumes much more oxygen and produces much more carbon dioxide as opposed to muscle tissue at rest. The body must have a mechanism to ensure that the rate of transport of these respiratory gases meet the need of the increased demand. Ventilation rate is under the control of an area of the medulla oblongata of the brainstem. This area of the medulla is known as your breathing center. The breathing center has two mechanisms that come into play when the rate of ventilation needs to increase. The first one are the receptor cells, known as chemoreceptors or chemosensors, located in the inner wall of the aorta and choroid arteries that detect the increase in carbon dioxide levels and the associated decrease in blood pH. When stimulated, these receptors send action potentials to the medulla's breathing center. The second mechanism is the medulla itself, which contains the same kind of chemosensors, and as the blood passes through the capillary beds located in the medulla, increased CO2 levels and decreased pH is detected. The normal blood pH is about 7.4, which is very slightly alkaline. The decrease in pH is due to dissociation of carbonic acid. Under normal circumstances, buffering of hemoglobin and plasma proteins prevents any change in pH. But when you are exercising heavily, the buffering mechanisms are overtaxed, and the excess hydrogen ions lower the pH. During vigorous exercise, the blood is becoming slightly less alkaline, changing from a pH of about 7.4 to no lower than 7.0, depending on the level of physical exertion. To increase ventilation rate, the medulla's breathing center sends action potentials to the diaphragm, intercostal muscles, which are found between the ribs, and muscles in the abdomen. The mechanism of breathing is not altered, just the frequency. With an associated increase in heart rate, the body tissues are supplied with an increased supply of O2, necessary for their increased skeletal muscle activity. When the physical exertion ceases, or at least decreases, the chemoreceptors detect the decrease in carbon dioxide and the bloodstream, or the corresponding increase in blood plasma pH, and a set of action potentials is generated that leads to a decrease in the ventilation rate.
Hello, my name's Monique, and today we shall be discussing Chapter H.6.6. In this chapter, we will outline possible causes of asthma and its effects on the gas exchange system. So, first off, what is asthma? Asthma is the chronic inflammation of the airways to the lungs. In the lungs, this inflammation leads to swelling and mucus production, resulting in reduced airflow and bronchospasms. During an acute asthma attack, constriction of the bronchi smooth muscle may cause significant airflow obstruction, which in turn may be life-threatening. Common asthma symptoms include the chest tightening, wheezing and coughing, and shortness of breath. Asthma is caused by a number of variables and reoccurring and violent triggers, including what we know as ass face. So, ass face is the acronym we will use to memorize this. So, what is ass face? Well, A stands for allergens. The S for smoke and scented products. The other S for stress and anxiety. F for food and preservatives and certain medications. The other A for arthropods, such as dust mites. And C for cold air. And finally, E for exercise, which leads to the increased respiratory rate. Yay!
after H6, we go to H.6.7, where we will explain the problems gas exchange at high altitudes and the way the body acclimates. So, at high altitudes, the air pressure is lower. Hence, there is a lower partial pressure of oxygen, and therefore there is less oxygen in the air. This makes it more difficult for hemoglobin to take up and transport oxygen from the alveoli and causes many tissues to receive less oxygen. A person unaccustomed to these conditions will display symptoms of low oxygen. In addition to low oxygen intake, a person unaccustomed will also experience fatigue, breathlessness, a rapid pulse, and may experience nausea and headaches because there is less concentration of oxygen at higher altitudes, so it is harder for the body to take in oxygen for the body. Over time, the body will begin to acclimatize, and the lower oxygen levels at high altitudes are normal. Red blood cell production increases to increase oxygen transport. The red blood cells will have higher hemoglobin content with an increase in affinity for oxygen, and ventilation rate increases to increase gas exchange and airflow for a larger vital capacity. The muscles also produce more myoglobin and increase vascularization, so denser capillary networks, to encourage oxygen to diffuse into the muscles. The kidneys will begin to secrete an alkaline urine, improve buffering of blood pH, so that increases, so to where it becomes basic, and there's increased lactate clearance within the body. People permanently living at higher altitudes will have a greater lung surface area and larger chest sizes. It can also be noted that even athletes train at higher altitudes, so that way their red blood cells can produce more red blood cells and carry more oxygen throughout the body.